Okay, Mark 13. I gave you so much time. If you're not there and you didn't know where it was, cheat. Just pretend you're there. Here we go. Mark 13. In fact, Mark 13, I want to explain what it's about, the whole chapter, and then we're going to kind of dissect it. Mark chapter 13 is a chapter that is often referred to, or we speak of it as an end times chapter. So it's a subject, it's a topic, or it's a chapter where Jesus talks about the last days. And we'll explain, don't feel bad, we'll explain what that means. But in the entire chapter, Jesus describes the last days. And he tells us what's important and what to be paying attention to. So we're going to talk about that. Every generation of Christians believes they've got it right. It's one thing, as you study church history, you'll discover that. Everybody believes like they've got it right now. So 300 years ago, they're looking at theology, they're looking at the Bible, and they're studying, and they're saying, yeah, we get it now. We got it right. And then 100 years later, we look back and you say, here's where they were missing this thing or that thing. They did great on this topic, but they were a little weak on this topic. And so end times is a subject that has definitely really kind of taken off in the last, say, 50, 60 years of church history. It's a subject that people are really interested in. There are those who see very clear signs out there that point to the end time. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to focus on what Jesus says here in Mark chapter 13. When we talk about it, there are also massive questions that we have. Huge questions. What exactly does this mean? And there are some really great views that exist. What we're going to do is we're going to try to stay fixed on the things that we do know and express our own views when we have views and beliefs and ideas. But I want you to start, if you would, with me in verse 24 of Mark 13. So we're going to start a little bit further down, because Jesus, towards the end of this chapter, the end of this conversation he has with the disciples, he says a few things in there that I believe are of the kind of the most importance. And I want to hit on those, and then we'll go back and look at the rest of the chapter. So we're picking up in the middle of his conversation, but we'll get the whole conversation in a little bit. Verse 24, Mark 13, beginning in verse 24. Jesus says this, "In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Now, learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and it puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. You also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the door. Assuredly, I say, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." Verse 32. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to each his work, and he commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch, therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch." So we want to really focus our attention on the things that we can understand. And if you were reading that and you were like, there's a whole bunch of things in there I don't totally understand, you can join the club of most of us. There's a lot of things in there that we say, I think I have an understanding, we think we have a good perspective. We're going to focus on the areas that we're absolutely certain about. And the thing that we're absolutely certain about is the thing that Jesus said several times. It's one word, watch. As Jesus speaks to you and me, just like he did to his disciples in that day, on the subject of the last days, his exhortation, his message he says, what I say to you, I say to all, watch. So what does that mean? What does it mean to watch? And we want to talk about that. To watch, again, most of us might already have a concept of what that means. The idea is just simply this. It's to be vigilant. It's that I'm living with a sense of anticipation. I have an expectation that at some moment, Jesus is going to come back for me. And so when Jesus said to his disciples then, and then he said, and I'm saying it to all of you, watch, be vigilant. Live your life. Here's a further translation to that. You ready? Live your life in such a way that when I come back, you're ready. Be ready to see me. And so the Bible tells us then clearly an exhortation that we are to be looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of our salvation, and we are to be looking for Jesus. We look to him every day, but we're also to look for him. And so the advice is this: live your life with vigilance, with anticipation, with expectation. My grandparents had these little poodle. They weren't little, but they were not. If you have poodles, I apologize, but I didn't like these poodles. They were their babies in a way that was like, oh, come on, we were eating the same food, it felt like at times, which I now parent people do. But these dogs they lived vigilant. When we would leave, they were right at that window just waiting for my grandparents to come home. They were anticipating, they were expecting, they were ready. They were terrible dogs, but boy, were they excited about their owners coming home. And I think about that, and I think, how am I living my life today that is expecting that Jesus... Now, when you're studying for a subject like this, it's easy to sound like I always live that way, because I've been thinking about it all week. You just found out. Okay, so I can sound or look better, because it's as if I've been thinking about it since Monday. You guys just figured it out. But the reality is that every single one of us is in the same situation. Tomorrow comes, Tuesday comes, Wednesday comes, and we just move on. We move into a regular week of life. And I don't think you're supposed to feel bad for that. I don't think the condemnation message is, why aren't you watching for Jesus? I think it's the opposite. You have an opportunity to anticipate Jesus. In other words, you can build that into your daily life, into your home life, into your work week. You and I can build in an expectation that, who knows, maybe today Jesus will come back. Now, some of us can say, well, we've been thinking that for 50, 60, 70, 80, 2,000 years, and nothing's happened. And that's the exciting part. When we talk about the last days, when Jesus talks about the last days, the question is this: is he talking about days? 24-hour periods of time. The answer, as we really put it all together, looking at the end times, is no. It's not just a 24-hour period, 48 or 72. This is talking about a stretch of time that is culminating in his return and the end of the world, kind of as we know it. And maybe it's a surprise, maybe not. But when Jesus speaks about the last days, he speaks about the last days in the day that he was here on the earth. In other words, when he's talking to John and James and Peter, for them, it's the last days. So the message then is this: if it was the last days then, what are they now? The really last days, And I know that there are some out there that will tell us that, this sign points to this and this sign points. I just read there was an article in the news that said they said April 23rd Jesus is coming back. Now, don't take that out of context and put that part up on YouTube, what I just said, okay? But it was all over, all the news sites, that April 23rd, there's this Christian group, and I use the term in a loose sense, saying April 23rd is the day Jesus is coming back, which is, it always baffles my mind when Jesus said, nobody knows the day or the hour. And I'm having a hard time with the Greek and the English and any language you choose, because Jesus was really clear. Literally, nobody knows. Nobody knows it. So April 23rd, I kind of feel like it won't be that day just because Jesus is not going to let them have that. But I don't know. I don't want to be mean about that. I almost feel like that's the day I'm not going to have anticipation because, But the Bible tells us that we are, so let me rephrase this. There's people who say, look at this sign, look at this happening, look at this world event, look at this thing that just occurred. And I don't want to discredit any of that. What I want to do is take it a little step back. Rather than trying to show you that we're in the last days by every prophecy that's out there that's happening and to try to make every sign fit into a last days verse, let me just say this. If 2,000 years ago Jesus said it's the last days, hello, it's closer. Do you get it? It's a lot closer. So I don't know if everything that's happening in the world directly points that we're, imminent return of Jesus. But what I do know is if 2,000 years ago he said it's the last days, what would he say to you if he was speaking to you right now? It's really the last days. We must live with a sense of anticipation. We must live in a way where we are watching for his return. So go back to the top of Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. If watch is our exhortation, let's see what we're watching for exactly. Let's see what it's all culminating to. Verse 1, as Jesus went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here?" And Jesus answered, and he said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. That shall not be thrown down." In those days, the temple was the coolest, most beautiful. It was magnificent. It was the greatest building in the whole region. I mean, it's covered in gold, and what wasn't gold was marble. And imagine when everybody else is living in mud huts, in essence, a building, by the way, Jerusalem is on a hill, so you can see it from so far away. So you've got this city on a hill, and you've got this massive structure covered in gold and marble, and everybody else lives in mud. Can you imagine how amazing that building must have been? I mean, have you seen any, if you travel over to Europe, you can see some magnificent buildings, beautiful architecture. So, what was it like in that day to see the temple? And the disciples have heard Jesus speaking about the temple. Jesus has said things that nobody would have said. Nobody who wanted to live would say the things Jesus said. You wouldn't say that. Destroy this temple, in 3 days I will rebuild it. Just using the temple in that context freaked people out. Because this was not only a building of prize, of value, but this was the building where man and God met. This was the building in their minds that God gave designs to David to be built where he would meet with humanity. And not just humanity, but specifically the Jew. This was their treasure. The temple, it was the center of all Jewish life. Everything culminated at the temple. And it's really a true point. Everything did culminate with the temple. Sins were forgiven in that building by God. Sacrifices were made in that building for God. Worship to God. It all resonated from that building. So there's the disciples sitting with Jesus. They've heard him talking about the temple. He's using these phrases that, if you've discovered as you read through the New Testament, the disciples did what a lot of us do sometimes when we hear Bible teaching. We go, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And inside we're saying, I have no idea what he's talking about. Not one word made sense. And Jesus would say things and then they weren't really comprehending the idea. The Bible tells us that when the temple was destroyed, the Bible doesn't tell us that. Jesus described that the temple was going to be destroyed in the Bible. And then afterwards, we're told by, and you've heard his name probably a million times, but if not, I'll say it again. There was a historian in that day. His name was Josephus. And he witnessed these events, and he described the destruction of the temple. Jesus said in the scriptures that not one stone would remain upon another. When you destroy a building, you can go for it and really knock it down, but to remove every stone upon another seems a little bit overboard. So why would that happen? What happened is a fire, Josephus tells us, fire started on the Temple Mount. Gold melted. What do you think Roman soldiers were going for? They chipped every rock away to get the gold. So much so, and if you've ever been to Israel or ever heard this, maybe you've wondered why this is true. How is it possible that we don't know exactly where the temple would be today? You go to the Temple Mount, you can see some of the mosques that are up there, there's 2. And then they say, the temple should be here as well. And you ask someone, where would the temple be exactly? And you'll get 2 or 3 different opinions. How is it possible that we don't know exactly where the temple would be? Simple answer. The destruction of the temple was so complete, there's no remnant of what was the foundation for that. There's no concept of every stone was overthrown. It was a total destruction, just as Jesus said there would be. And the disciples are curious about this, so let's hear what he has to say. Verse 3, Jesus says this: As he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" These are 2 questions. In Luke's gospel, Jesus answers question 1. In Luke's gospel, Jesus answers question 1. In Mark's gospel, Jesus answers question 2. So we're focused on question 2. Question 2 is this: what will be the sign when these things will be fulfilled? Verse 5, Jesus, answering, began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am,' and will deceive many. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines and troubles. These are the beginning of sorrows." Jesus describes, in essence, 3 major events or major issues that will be happening. But these are not the sign of the last days. These are the beginning of sorrows. And those 3 issues are this: spiritual deception, war, and natural disaster. Now, as you look back at history, all 3 of those things have been happening all the time. You can't go somewhere in the world where there's not somebody trying to deceive somebody else spiritually. There are more wars happening right now than there ever has in history. And natural disaster, I don't need to describe that to you. But Jesus said these are not the sign of the last days. These are the beginning of sorrows. A better way that we would understand what Jesus is saying is this. Jesus is saying those events are the beginning of labor pains. It's not the end, but it's the beginning. And Jesus said from the days that he was there, from that time to now, we will see spiritual deception, we will see war, and we will see natural disaster. And history proves that he was correct. Those things have always been happening. Verse 9, Jesus says this: "But watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils. You will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought up before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, a father his child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved." Now, before we even really dig into the issues that Jesus is talking about, we have to again ask ourselves, who is he talking to? And this is the point that I think has become so confusing for so many of us. Who is Jesus speaking to? And again, to help us understand that, I believe it's helpful to remember, when are the last days? Are we living in the last days? I believe the answer is yes. Was the Apostle Paul living in the last days? I believe the answer is yes. When Jesus spoke these words, were they now living in the last days? And I believe the answer is yes. And so when we try to define who is Jesus speaking to, we usually say this: he's speaking to saints in the last days. Okay, who's that? It's every single Christian that has lived since the cross. How can you be so sure? Well, when was the last time you were in fear of being beaten in a synagogue? Anyone? Don't raise your hand if you were. You're like, yeah, it was me. But was that a real threat and a real danger in the days of Paul and Peter and James? I think James would unquestionably raise his hand and say, yeah, it's a problem. They killed me. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So Jesus isn't just speaking to one group, and we want to say, oh, he must be talking to the Gentiles alone. Well, he's obviously not. He's speaking to all believers since the cross. That you and I are to live our lives in expectation that at any moment Jesus is coming back. Well, what do I do until then? Well, understand, there's going to be persecution. You're going to be persecuted in the synagogue. You can go ahead and apply that into your life. You probably aren't going to be persecuted in the synagogue. I can't say that for sure, I guess, but I'm pretty confident. But you might be persecuted at work. You might be persecuted at home. In fact, the Bible kind of gives us the idea that if we're doing this all right, we should be persecuted. Those who desire to live godly in Christ, what? They will suffer persecution. And right now, listen, we might be living pretty good, and you don't have to feel bad for that or feel like you're a bad Christian for that. But I hope you do know that this is a terrible time to be a Christian in many parts of the world. It's a brutal time to be a Christian for so many people. And so Jesus knew that he's going to be telling this to people from so many different walks of life, so many different issues, so many different generations. The last days are upon us. And Jesus understood that, whether Jew, whether Gentile, whether you live in a country where there is peace, or whether you live in a country where it is deadly to follow Christ. He's talking to all of us to be ready to watch. Verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation, I always got this mixed up with the abominable snowman. I don't know, just expressing my own immaturity there, okay? So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down or into the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight might not be in winter, for in those days there will be tribulation such as has not been seen since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor will ever be. And unless the Lord shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Verse 21, and if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I have told you all things beforehand. There's some elements of these verses, these words of Jesus that for so long in my life were very difficult to even comprehend. Because I think like many of us in here, we've lived when you look at the world and you look what the world goes through, we've lived really good lives. Really good lives. Like top % lives in the world. And that's not something we have to feel bad about. That's where, I don't know. I don't even know how to explain it other than that's just our life. But I did have the opportunity when living in Budapest, Hungary. Many of you are familiar with this move that happened of refugees from the Middle East, mainly Syria, all the way to Germany. The German premier invited 1 million refugees to come to her country. The problem is that you have to go through other countries to get to her country. So it's not like a straight shot from Syria to Germany, okay? I know you know that, but that's just in case. Okay. And we had the opportunity as a church, and Joy and I and our family, to literally have 12 to 15,000 people every day trekking, walking from Syria to Germany. Most amazing experience of our lives, hands down. I have never shared the gospel more in my life. I have prayed, I'm sure some of you have too, I've always prayed, Lord, it would be so cool if you would open doors in the Middle East. I never dreamed he would bring the Middle East to me. It seemed impossible. Thousands of people heard the gospel as they walked from Syria to Germany. I'm still in touch with many of them and the new lives they have. Some of them are now believers, and many of them now living safe lives. But the reason I'm mentioning this is this. When I've read this section, the idea of don't even go back into your house, just run. Don't go. If you're in the field, drop what you've got and leave. I got to be honest, and maybe it's expressing my own naivety. That didn't even make sense to me. How could something be so bad that you would literally just drop what you're doing and walk away? You don't even have a minute to grab a little bag or, I don't know, grab an extra t-shirt or something? No, you have no time. Until I met a young man, his name was Muhammad. Muhammad was 30 years old, and he had left Syria. And Muhammad and I, we became friends. We had a few hours, we only had a few hours to get to know each other. But Muhammad was, and his words, not mine, Muhammad said, I am every Westerner's nightmare, a single Muslim man. He said, I'm the one that everybody's afraid of. I get it. He said, but you have to understand. He said, I had a wonderful business. I don't want to go to Germany. I love Syria. I love my home. I left my family, not married and kids, but parents, brothers, sisters. And he shared with me his story. He said, I was there. I owned a shop. ISIS came. That's no problem for me because I'm a Muslim. That's what I thought. I'm a Muslim. They're Muslims. I'm going to be okay. He said, until on the morning that I went to work, and the rest of the shop owners, because they were capitalists, were executed. And he said, I dropped my keys, and I turned, and I walked, and I have not stopped walking. And I thought for the first time in my life that Jesus wasn't talking to some of us who have never experienced anything like that. He's talking to people who, that's a reality. And the world that we live in today, and again, it's not our fault that we've not experienced that, but we have to try to understand it. There are people today who have to literally drop what they're doing and run to survive. That's who Jesus is talking about. That in the last days, things are going to become so difficult for the Christian that they won't have time to grab anything. They just got to run for their life. And Jesus even said, and you'd think, we're all praying for the last days. Jesus says, pray that those days aren't upon you. Pray that you're not the one living in that day. It's going to be so bad, so difficult. So what is the abomination of desolation? It's referred to, and I'll just give you the chapters and you can read it on your own. Daniel 9, Daniel 11, and Daniel 12. Daniel 9, 11, and 12 speak about or prophesy about the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that causes desolation. I told you the temple is an important building. It's really an important building. And the abomination, or something that is an abomination, is when, for the Jew, it was creating an idol or a statue or a false god in the place of God. And so several times throughout their history, there would be attempts by the conquering a nation that was over them. That nation would try to set up a god, a false god, a statue. And the Jews would erupt in not only protests, but willing to die, and many would die, to stop that from happening. But sometimes they couldn't. And there are several cases where in order to subjugate the Jew, the conquering nation would set up a false god in the temple. And it was an abomination to the Jews. So much so that they would avoid the temple while that conquering nation had that statue in there. Nobody would go to the temple during those days. That place had become an abomination. But Daniel describes an event that has not yet happened. And the event that he describes is this. He says, a day is coming when it will be such an abomination that the temple will be forsaken forever. The Jew will never go back to that temple. And there have been some terrible abominations that have happened to the Jews by the Gentile nations. But this has not yet happened. And the Bible tells us what it's going to look like. In fact, in 2 Thessalonians, you can either quickly turn there, you can look on the screens. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 says this. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. He who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. And he sits as God in, where? The temple of God, showing himself that he is God. The abomination that causes total desolation has not yet happened. It is a future event. It is an event where the man known as the son of perdition, you've heard of him described as the Antichrist. He is the person who is in opposition to the true God. And he will lead a rebellion that will look first like peace and it will end in utter destruction. And he will set himself up in the temple, declare himself to be God, and any Jew who has lived through this point of history will utterly forsake the temple forever. They will walk away. It is done. That place will no longer have any value. Now, you're saying, that's all interesting, but the problem is this. There is no temple right now. Good point. I have nothing else to say on that. Still waiting for that. It's going to happen someday. And when it does, one will rise up to bring peace to the world, but it's a false peace. He's known as the Antichrist. And at some point in his reign, he will go into the temple, which is wrong, and he will declare himself God, and this will be the abomination that causes total desolation. The people who live on the earth in those days will experience a kind of hell that people previously have not experienced. The world will be in utter chaos. Jesus, in the very beginning where we read at the last part of Mark 13, Jesus describes a fig tree. And if you've been coming here on Sundays, we talked about a fig tree not too long ago when Jesus cursed a fig tree. It feels like Jesus has something against fig trees. So Jesus in this story, again, picking on a fig tree, but he tells us, you know when there's leaves on the fig tree, you know what season it is. In other words, he's saying, listen, if you've got crops, you know what's fall or summer or spring or winter based on what's happening with crops, based on what's happening with your trees, your fig tree, the apple orchard. You know what season it is. You might not know what day it is. You don't know what time it is, but you can tell the season that you are in based on what's happening with the tree, if it's a healthy tree. And Jesus uses the same analogy. You and I are supposed to know the season that we are living in. So what season are we living in? It's really simple. The last days. We are living in the last days. Are we right at the last days? I have no idea. But I'm supposed to live that way. I'm supposed to live that way. No one, Jesus said, knows the day or the hour. No one. Verse 34, and here's where I want us to come to kind of bring this, start landing this plane here. Verse 34. It's like a man going to a far country who left his house, gave authority to his servants to each his work, and he commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Jesus gives an analogy. It's a great analogy. It's worthwhile to just let it sink in. Here's the analogy. Jesus says a man had a field and he went to a far country. So who's the man who owned a field and went to a far country? It's Jesus. God bought and made this world. And in this story, he's gone to a far country. What is the house that he built? It's the world. The house is the world that we live in. We are his servants who he has given authority to, each his work. And he has commanded us to watch and wait for his return. Just last week, we looked at when Jesus used the same analogy of a vineyard, and he sent servants to the people given authority, and they beat them, and then they killed them. And then finally the owner sent his son, and they looked at, if we kill the son, it's ours. And so they killed the son. And Jesus is telling the story, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the religious leaders are sitting there, and they're angry. Why? Because they knew that he was talking about them. In the same way now, listen, Jesus is talking about us. The owner bought a field, bought a home, and then went to a far country, and he gave the ownership of that. He gave the ministry of that over to his servants. Who are his servants? It's us. We've been entrusted with the things of God in this world, in this life, and in this season. This is our time. So what are we supposed to do with our time? We're supposed to each do his own work. What are you here for from God's perspective? What unique, beautiful, creative, essential part of God's kingdom are you? Each to do his own work, but with an eye that's always looking up. Any day now, any moment now. Who knows? Maybe, what does it mean to live watching? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're constantly, distracted by looking up. You're supposed to be doing a job and you're constantly looking up. You're not going to get a lot done that way. It's half-hearted working, isn't it? What are you doing? Oh, I only got half of it done. I was too busy looking up, Jesus could come back at any moment. He's not talking literally just constantly looking up, constantly distracted. No, he's saying this. He's saying, live in such a way that you're ready to come back. That when Jesus comes back, it's an analogy, it's not a literal. When Jesus comes back and he says, how did you do with the work that I gave you? You can say, I tried. You probably aren't going to say, I did amazing. We're probably, at best we're going to say, man, I tried. And you were a great help, but sometimes I failed, sometimes I did good. I had good days, I had bad days, but you were gracious every day. But the idea is, what if the Lord were to come back and I were to say, oh, who are you again? Because I didn't live in such a way that I knew whose I belonged to. Who it was that owned my life and in whose I was serving and in whose house I was a part of. What does it mean to live watching or vigilant or with expectation? It means that I choose and obey the Lord now. An expectation that at any moment he could come back. And when I will before him and say, look at how amazing I was, I have every certainty that we will fall down. And we won't be talking about how amazing we were. We will be talking about how amazing he is. But I want to live my life in such a way that I'm ready. So what do I do? Two things. Serve the Lord who has given you today. Today. Well, one day I'll do. Don't wait for one day. One day never comes. So one day never shows up. It's like when somebody says, oh, we're waiting until we have enough money to have kids. Having kids. Because nobody can afford them. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm waiting until this happens. And there's wisdom in some parts of life, but when it comes to your decision to follow the Lord, listen, please hear me on this. Today is the day. It's not tomorrow. It's today. Today is the day you say, I am going to give it to the Lord. You want to live with anticipation? Then let God have today. And let me commend you, not just exhort you. Let me commend you. Well done. Not just that you're sitting in a chair, but you're sitting with an expectation. I believe God wants to speak. I want to hear, and I want to live it out. So serve the Lord with whatever he has given to you. Look to and look for Jesus. Look to him for help and look for him that at any moment he'll come back and take you home. Live a life where when Jesus comes back, he looks at you and he says, well done. Well done. And I think of us that hear well done are going to say, Lord, are you joking? I don't think it's well done. Lord, I've been a failure. Lord, I should have done more. When you and I meet Jesus, we will not look back and say, man, I wish I would have done myself just a little longer. It's just not going to happen. I'll look and I'm going to say, oh, Lord, I wish I'd given one more day, one more moment, one more conversation, one more smile to someone who needed to know that they're loved. I'm not going to say, man, if I had had 10 more minutes, I could have done more of my own thing. It's not going to happen. So we want to live today as if at any moment Jesus could come back. And that's not a boring way to live. It's pretty exciting. It's pretty exciting. It's the adventure that we live to him and for him. Don't miss it. Today is the day. Don't wait till tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes, but you have today. Live this day. Choose to do that. I'm going to live this day for the Lord. Let's pray.